To say that Yakuza has a colorful cast of villains and bosses would be comparable to stating that Metal Gear delves into political commentary. That is to say, it's such a no-brainer statement that it's effectively the makings of a linguistic lobotomy. From idealistic rivals, to a variety of wildlife, to modern-day aristocrats, and even kink manifestations, Yakuza effectively dabbled in nearly every type of opposing force in a narrative, barring something supernatural like a nigh-immortal cult leader. Wait a minute. Because of this, anyone who's been with the series for long enough likely won't be surprised by any new antagonist RGG introduces, and yet some of the most recent additions to the series have still been puzzling, for lack of a better word. For the purposes of today's brief discussion, we have a character from Like a Dragon Gaiden, meaning that yes, you should click away from this video if you haven't beaten this gem yet. But also, the character we'll be discussing is labeled as a bit of an anomaly for the series, considering his expected narrative impact. This is Nishitani III, the latest head of the Kijin clan, and someone who lords over his own private paradise, fittingly labeled the Castle. He also happens to be a Jingwon Mafia survivor, one of the few characters deemed worthy of QTEs in this deliberately constrained project, and an individual 90% of the community completely forgot about after a month, save for a number of fan artists and or fujoshis. So why is this character someone we would now label as puzzling? Well, on paper, he has all the predispositions to become a massive fan favorite, a la Han Joongi from Yakuza 6, or hell, maybe even an underdog a la the original Nishitani, to a lesser extent. But Nishitani III is instead somewhat of an early-day Yakuza antagonist, a la much of the non-final bosses from the first 5 mainlines. Someone who is unapologetically evil, impedes your progress on a number of occasions, but makes up for that via some entertaining clashes that are comparable to watching a good, over-the-top action movie. Given how the quality of writing in the Yakuza series has gradually improved over time, a vocal minority of the community seems to have expected more from this character. A matter that apparently extends to both Gaiden games and Infinite Wealth, which are frequently labeled as a step back in many ways. Now, as I've already explored in my video Deconstructing Shishido Kosei, and delving into a certain boss fight from Chapter 12 of Infinite Wealth, we still have examples of RGG trying out different types of arc resolutions and more polished character build-up in the midst of their newest stories. However, this doesn't mean that every single character introduced will be a subject to such development, and Nishitani Kiwami over here is a great example of such an anomaly. I believe that his writing, intentionally or otherwise, can only be seen as a nod to the general theming of the trilogy, including Yakuza 7, Gaiden, and Infinite, because of the basic nature of Nishitani's character, and that he was never meant to reach the stardom of Joongi or the original Nishitani, despite what many had theorized before Gaiden's release. Unlike with my usual character analyses, the purpose of this video isn't to praise the subject's antics, but rather to kick them further into the dirt, cause an abhorrent individual like this one only serves the purpose he needs to in the story by being the antithesis to many modern RGG writing choices. So let's see why that is. First off, we'll do a brief rundown of this guy's role in the story. In Chapter 2, we are introduced to a place of utmost debauchery with supposedly limitless freedom. If you have the money, anything can be yours, and if you're broke, you're effectively relegated as this place's property. Considering the extremities of these possibilities, you'd expect a manipulative nutjob to be in charge of it all. And naturally, that's precisely what we got. Nishitani is originally just labeled as the head of the Kijin clan, and in Shishido's own words, someone who has it all. Youth, money, charm, a true model Kansai Yakuza. Yet the moment this description is given, it is followed up by a most deranged smile, giving away his true nature faster than any of his apparent thematic predecessors. Usually, you'd save something like this to be a shock reveal when the player least expects it, a la Joongi grilling his subordinate's face in Kanrai a bit after the title card. But unlike him, or even the originator of the Nishitani name, number 3 over here is significantly less concerned with the way that he is perceived. In fact, he is nothing more than a spoiled brat surrounded by his multitude of toys. He's weighed on hand and foot by nearly everyone in the castle, to the point where he could do literally anything here and it would just be shrugged off as an average Tuesday. Case in point, when the dude drives a bike at full speed through the castle, almost running over a bunch of his clientele while chasing Kiryu. But this begs the question, what would happen if someone tried to make a mockery of him on his home turf? Better yet, what if someone took him on outside the castle? How would he react? Well, that's when this guy fully deviates from his progenitors, as he veers closer to acting like a brat whose aforementioned toys were broken, leading him into a very on-the-nose tantrum. He rushes to fight Kiryu, gets his ass handed to him in front of his own men, and as soon as he wakes, he mandates a citywide manhunt for the dragon. This leads to us making a mockery of the entire Kijin clan for much of Chapter 4, as well as taking over the castle, before we eventually break through the group's HQ through our own initiative, because Nishiboy is still hiding behind his playthings. He may state how he wants to handle Kiryu himself, but even when he sees us at his doorstep, he waits for his underlings to presumably handle the situation, and leave their leader with the finishing blow. Compare this to someone like the original Nishitani, barges into your own home turf, calls the cops on himself, and then basically leaves you to come to his own home turf out of necessity, where he inevitably meets his end after a heart-to-heart type of fight and chat. Then you have the original Joongi, arguably the best villain to have sprung from the Jingwon Mafia. He makes a miraculous spectacle just to fight you, loses, still maintains a sportsmanlike image filled with showmanship for the public, and then personally goes after you, fighting you one-on-one, far away from his home base. With the way I described these characters side by side, this does make it feel like Nishi 3 is just a random nut that puts a blemish on the legacy of other noteworthy characters. So how would this treatment connect to a potential deeper value from his inclusion? Making someone who has all of these apparent credentials that echoed through the underworld via the bloodshed of his progenitors, someone who is both a Nishitani and a Jingwon survivor, how does the act of reducing someone like that to a pitiful yet dangerous brat benefit the story at large? Well, it boils down to theming. As has been hammered home in the most recent entries a dozen of times over, the age of Yakuza is through. Names and titles that once carried so much weight are mere window dressing these days, meaning that you need to be all the more certain of your convictions to make a name for yourself as a Yakuza, and more importantly, as a person. It's no longer enough to be a Tojo or Omi family patriarch. Your actions need to speak louder than this once steadfast hierarchy. You can see that very clearly in a character like Shishido, who uses his own strength to try and keep his underworld status in the modern age, whereas the Kijin patriarch basically lets his status do the heavy lifting for the most part. And despite all the titles he carries in the underworld, he still fails to be someone truly worthy of Kiryu's time beyond the most basic courtesy he is given. Nishitani III is treated as more of an annoyance, like he was the equivalent to the Dine and Dasher from Yakuza 0, but given a nuclear weapon to boot. I.e., he may be an annoyance, but he's still technically dangerous due to the overlapping circumstances, which is why he is given the bare minimum of attention necessary and is promptly left behind when all is said and done. This is precisely what's so great about it. The game doesn't frame him as someone with a deep story, compelling inner conflict, nor should it. He's someone who only perpetuates acts of violence to fulfill his depraved desires, with no goal beyond it. He is the textbook example of a villain for the sake of a villain. Now, frankly, this type of writing has been in abundance in the early days of Yakuza, but with how so many villains are given redemption arcs these days, that makes the prospect of a more old-school villain kind of come off as refreshing in Gaiden. So then, with all of that said, let's go back to the title of this video. Giving this Nishitani the title of puzzling is more so there to address the dissonance between player expectations and the final product, rather than to showcase him as someone complex. There may still be people who believe his inclusion to have been toned down from what it was intended to be due to Gaiden's short development time, but even if that were the case, the end result here isn't one that wastes his symbolic value. Just because someone isn't a deep character doesn't mean they can't benefit the story after all. And frankly, if there's one thing this character does well, apart from being an entertaining boss, is that he is a great tool to benefit Kiryu's on-screen antics in a somewhat vintage way. This is where I would like to repeat an observation of mine from quite a while ago, where I said that Gaiden feels exceptionally close to what the PS2 era of this franchise was like. Now, apart from the fact that Yakuza 1, 2, and Gaiden all have a significantly shorter runtime in the critical path than most games starting from Yakuza 5, the other point of comparison was the way its antagonists were treated. While we obviously had some standout villains with compelling motivations in all of these games, it felt like there was more of a focus on offering ones that served as obstacles and/or hateable figures first and foremost. So in that regard, individuals like Yoshimura, Nishitani, the multitude of Kijin clan foot soldiers and captains, alongside the opponents from the Colosseum, all reminded me of fights against bosses like Shindo in Yakuza 1, or the Color Gangs, or the different Jingwon members in Yakuza 2, and also individuals like the Man in Black and obviously the classic Colosseum fighters. We can always theorize about a deeper meaning behind the symbolism of a boss's inclusion, but at least on the surface, Gaiden shares a fair bit more with the DNA of old-school Yakuza than a number of the modern entries. This is where we circle back to the point I raised about Nishitani being a tool to benefit Kiryu, because in this game, our beloved dragon exhibits certain behavioral patterns that have remained dormant for quite a while. Look at moments like him sending a selfie with the castle girls to Nishitani, partying around Sotenbori to lure him out, even the cheekiness of his later interactions with Shishido. There are so many points that remind me of the guy who casually punched a statue in Yakuza 1, or the guy who swung from a chandelier to attack the Omi Alliance in Yakuza 2. This isn't to say that these patterns aren't still present in the games that were released in between these two eras, it's just that they felt more prominent here by nature of the shorter runtime and more direct nature of the experiences. In this regard, Nishitani in particular is a way for Kiryu to showcase that particular trait of his writing and blow off some steam while he's still on the Daidoji's leash, so to speak, and it works out amazingly. The fact that this guy is such irredeemable filth means that you can just let loose with Kiryu, like you did back in the day. There's no sappy speech about a difficult childhood here, or any empathy to evoke. What you see is what you get, which works out brilliantly for a side boss in a game that is technically a mere side story in the grander scheme of things. So, to that end, let's briefly look at how his boss fights further cement that deliberate simplicity of design. We have 3 boss fights against the Kijin Patriarch. All of them are bereft of a dynamic intro, and they all boast a cool QTE of their own. His general moveset is obviously very Nishitani coded, but with the addition of him utilizing a flash grenade in an attempt to jump you in a cowardly manner. This part of his demeanor is also hammered home by nature of him trying to jump you from the fire you kicked him into during the second encounter with him. Again, drawing a clear line between the type of character he is compared to the original Nishitani and Joongi. In a similar vein, the musical theme accompanying him, fittingly titled Psycho's Anthem, is effectively a more unhinged interpretation of the vibe that Theory of Beauty invoked in Yakuza 6, meaning that Nishitani 3 isn't even unique in this regard, which is a choice that I once again have to approve of. We've already gone over how this is someone whose one defining feature, beyond their carnal desires and lunacy, are the titles they inherited from pre-established icons and structures, so the fact that even his own theme song is but an imitation is exactly what he deserves. He will never be like the original Nishitani, or the most notable Jingwon leader, but even then, his depravity still allowed for an entertaining selection of fights, as any decent boss should do. So yeah, while he may be a quote-unquote puzzling villain, RGG still makes really good use of his screen time, and that's what's important for today's discussion. With all of that said, let me know what other bosses from Like a Dragon Gaiden you were surprised by, and whether you enjoyed what they brought to the game. Thank you for your time today, and I hope to see you again in the future. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, and have a great day. Cheers!